So we start our meeting with two assumptions. One is that we all agree that the planet's oceans are heating up and that the tides will continue rising at an accelerated pace. The other assumption is that we all understand that critical parts of Tam Valley lie at very low elevation, including Highway 1, the Tam Junction Business District, and of course the Birdland and K Park neighborhoods. These areas will experience increasingly frequent flooding as sea levels rise. So, given those assumptions, what can we do about it? What do we want to do about it? What do we value about living in Tam Valley and the surrounding areas that we want to preserve, to protect? And how will we prioritize what we value? For example, if we say we want to protect a vibrant business district and roadways that remain passable while enhancing the health of our ecosystems, will we have to make trade-offs? How much will it cost? No question it will be very expensive, so who's going to pay for it? The Tam Valley Sea Level Rise Task Force, which is part of the Tam Valley NRG network, has been working for nearly 2 years now to learn about the realities of sea level rise for Tam Valley, to communicate those findings to the community through online forums, neighborhood focus groups, and by reaching out via email with our partners, including the Tam Valley Neighborhood Response Group Network. So, all along, our goal has been, by December 2022, to develop prioritized guidelines for sea level rise adaptation in Tam Valley that are science-based, realistic, and reflect the will of residents and businesses. These guidelines can then be used to guide decision-making at the local, state, and federal levels. Tonight, we are asking you to listen to this amazing panel of experts we have assembled for you, who will help us understand what our options are for adaptation, what our options for adaptation to sea level rise may be. You're going to hear a lot of information. There'll be a lot to process, I assure you. After they have presented, we want you to talk about it with your table mates. Ask your questions and share your reactions through notes and a survey that's on your table. It is from these reactions that the task force will assemble a draft of the guidelines and submit them to the community for comments and considerations. I'll explain this more after the panel presentations. So, our agenda for the meeting is as follows. I'm doing the introduction. We'll have a keynote and context setting by our supervisor, Stephanie Moulton-Peters. Then we'll have our panelists for about 40 minutes total. Then we'll break into table discussions for about 20 minutes, and you'll take notes and make comments. Then we'll do some reporting out to the whole crowd so everybody hears what everybody's thinking. Then we'll go through next steps, what we're planning on doing next with all this information, and ask you to complete the survey that's on your tables. We are very fortunate to have as our Marin County District 3 Supervisor, Stephanie Moulton-Peters. We've had many meetings with Stephanie and her aides in the past couple years. She started our wonderful movie, Waters Rising, which is streaming on our website, and by the way, was produced by John and Sylvia Duncan. John is on the camera back there. If you haven't seen the film, it's on our website. Do see it, it's fantastic. And Stephanie really gets what Tam Valley is facing. She will be the president of the Board of Supervisors in 2023, and she did not hesitate when we asked her to keynote this meeting. We're honored to welcome Supervisor Stephanie Moulton-Peters.
Thank you, Ted, and all the members of the Sea Level Rise Committee. Good evening, everyone. How many people have attended a Sea Level Rise meeting before? Can you raise your hand? Yeah, quite a few of you. How many of you, this is your first or first time in Sea Level Rise? Okay, so we're about half-half. That's good for me to know. So let me just say, Tam Valley has been a leader in looking at sea level rise for several years now. Some of us got together in around 2010, if not sooner, and said, this is coming, and doing nothing is really not an option. So some intrepid souls, my predecessor, Kate Sears, being one of them, and many of you in this room as well, got together in a very similar way all those years ago to take a first look at sea level rise. And you may recall, we actually had quite a large meeting up the road at the Mill Valley Community Center, where we had table exercises like you're going to do tonight. A lot has changed, and we know a lot more since those early years. You are going to hear from a wonderful panel tonight of people who really know their stuff in this area and really bring the most cutting-edge knowledge of what are our opportunities to adapt and how do we do this most successfully using a lot of different tools at our disposal. What I want to share and made the point in the wonderful movie, thank you, John, for making such a beautiful movie, that really summarized, we have solutions to sea level rise. You'll hear the green ones, you'll hear the gray ones. That's not the hard part. The hard part is the political will to implement and finding the money to do it. And you're going to hear about that tonight as well, because there are some silver linings, particularly for this community. But I'm not going to do the spoiler alert and say what they are, Mark, so you get to do that. But nonetheless, this is going to take a lot of work for all of us, but building the political will, that's all of you tonight, and that's a lot of what this is part of. So we started a number of years ago doing what some of you may know, the vulnerability assessment. We've actually mapped, thanks to Chris Choo and others, we've mapped the areas where sea level rise is going to happen at different elevations over time. We know the impacted areas. And so here's an interesting thing to consider. So I'm your neighbor up the road in Mill Valley, back in Blytheville Canyon, not far from downtown Mill Valley. And if you look at where Marin County started and our development patterns at the turn of the last century, our little downtowns tended to be on the higher elevation areas out of harm's way. You can just go around our communities, none of them are built close to the water for the most part. Even in Sausalito, the old Sausalito is up on the hills for the most part. After World War II, what happened? We had a lot of former GIs and other military, and they thought California was pretty darn nice, and they weren't going back to wherever they'd come from, and so we built a whole lot of new housing. And where did we put that? We put it in the flat areas, and there's the problem for Marin County. We don't have a lot of flat areas. Our hillsides drop practically right into the water. They certainly do right here. They do in Sausalito. We get a little breathing room up in Mill Valley where we've got some area inland. But you can go up all of Marin County and see post-World War II development and where it happened. And guess what? It's in low-lying areas. It's in former marshes that we drained and filled. And it's along the little estuaries, right along the water where people always like to live, right along the creeks, along the water and on the coast. But that's where we built some of our homes from the last 60 or 70 years. And this area, of course, is one of those areas. So what happens? Sea level rise has come. We're seeing now that the flooding that we used to experience on a periodic basis every winter is more frequent and it's higher. And so the reality that climate change is happening is here, and I don't want to stay in the problem because we're going to move into the solution tonight. What I want to leave you with for now, there are many projects going on, and you'll hear about them. Marin County, along with other counties around the Bay, are working on demonstration projects, green and gray. And we're having some success. You can go all around the world and see how cultures and countries have been living with water, including the Netherlands, for a very long time. Now, would we be like Rotterdam and put in big dams and locks and all that? I'm not sure we would because they're terribly expensive to operate. But there are solutions. So it's really an exercise now in what are the right solutions at this time, and how do we grow into those over time as we learn more about it, and how do we start more and then build over time. So you're going to hear that. I want to acknowledge Kevin Conger, your neighbor, who's sitting right here in the front row. Kevin serves on your flood zone district board, and they are really the front line. Thank you for being part of that, Kevin. Dealing with flooding right now is the most important thing we can do right now, while we're cognizant of needing to plan the next 20, 50, 100 years. And this is where it looks like the problem solving is going, is that we're not going to solve for the next 100 years all at once. We're probably going to do it in increments in the areas that are most impacted first, and for a period of time through 2050, and then we're going to come back and do the next level of work. Anyway, that's my working theory. I'm going to turn it over to the experts who really know what they're doing. But I invite you to sit back, buckle your seatbelts, but mostly you're going to hear from some very knowledgeable people who will share with you really what is going on in the state of the art tonight. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you.
And so we've always been really interested in the water levels, way before sea level rise became big news. And as part of that, we've been looking at how we restore wetlands in the bay, and now more recently, how we're using those to help adapt to sea level rise. As you can tell from my accent, I'm not from around here. I live in the East Bay, but actually originally from Europe. And in Europe, we studied sea level rise a lot longer ago, much longer ago, in the 1980s and 1990s. A lot of our projects already incorporated sea level rise. When I came here 20 years ago, we didn't really talk about it very much, but it is now very much an ongoing issue, which Stephanie has really highlighted for us. So one of the places that we have an advantage of here is that we're already thinking about the shoreline. In those wetland restorations, we've been thinking about how to manage the shoreline. And so we have an advantage. This is at Hamilton Airfield. As you go up towards Novato, it's a big restoration. It was an airfield until about 7 or 8 years ago. The Corps of Engineers put a lot of sediment in there, and we built marshes. That's for ecological restoration, for the management of species in the bay. But it also serves as a barrier or as a buffer against the bay and about sea level rise. And so we're learning from these types of projects how to manage the shoreline in the longer term. Because marshes have a great ability to keep up with sea level rise. As the water rises, more sediment is deposited and the marshes rise. They also have vegetation which can knock down waves, and it stops the waves reaching the inner parts of the shoreline. So they do have a value there. They're not going to stop sea level rise, and none of these natural solutions will stop sea level rise, but they do provide a buffer. Another buffer at the bayward end of the marsh is eelgrass and oyster reefs. Now, we used to have eelgrass, a lot more eelgrass in the bay, and it does provide the dampening of the shoreline. We've lost a lot through the burial, as Stephanie pointed out, people building, extending towns and cities into the bay. So providing that new habitat back by restoring those areas, but also using their value for attenuating waves and for reducing water levels is an important element in this area. But it's not the only solution. So marshes and eelgrass and oyster reefs, you'll find examples of those. Pilot project down at San Rafael that's going on at the moment. Those are all elements that we can place in here which provide good habitat, but also provide some protection from flooding and protection from waves. Another type of project you have around here are beaches. This is Arambaroo Island, where a beach has been restored. There used to be lots of beaches in the bay. There was one big one between Richmond all the way down towards Emeryville. It was called Fleming Beach. But as you know, that's where Highway 80 is now, and so most of it's under concrete. But these beaches were significant. They provide that natural barrier, again, a dynamic barrier that can evolve and change with sea level rise. And so slowly we're starting to put those back. And so the beaches at Arambaroo has been placed back. There's work at Greenwood Beach in Sausalito. A number of places where Marin, where those steep hill slopes come down to the bay, is a good place to place beaches. So there's a number of elements that we can do here. And we have a lot of experience. We have over 40, 50 years of experience of these kinds of restorations, ever since the McAteer-Petrus Act from the 60s, which protected the bay. Since then, we've been restoring it. And so we can draw maps, and this is one example from the work that we've been doing, is where could you place these elements which will provide a benefit? Now, you don't, you could choose, we have a lot of clever engineers, you could choose for beaches to be built anywhere. But beaches actually are part of the landscape, and we need to think about where they are appropriate. The same with marshes, the same with the eelgrass. Where do we place these elements that make sense, not only for us to provide protection, but also make sense for the species and the natural bay itself? So in my presentation, there's a series of links. I encourage you to go to look at these reports and look at these maps and look at the resources that are available for you to understand how and where these types of elements may be, because you can incorporate them in the plans that you're starting to develop as a group here. And there are a series of questions we need to ask ourselves about when you're deciding what to do. It's not like a cookbook. You can say, I'll take one of those and two of these, and I'll mix them together, and I'll form the perfect place. Really want to find out why we're suggesting to do restorations in certain places, and why we're trying to do adaptation. So what are the natural opportunities? A lot of the historical marshes have been lost, but we need certain conditions for them to survive. We need sediment, we need wave energy, we need flat open spaces. And so trying to find those combinations is important. And then secondly, what are you trying to protect? What is the hazard you're facing, which is probably, in our case, is going to be flooding from the bay or from creeks. What is at risk? What are the communities? What are the houses? What are the businesses that are at risk, and what level of protection they need? And how much do we want to place into providing the protection as opposed to how much you're actually protecting? So those are the first types of questions. Then you start thinking about, okay, what role could marshes and the natural solutions play in this? What is appropriate? And particularly, what are the elevations that we have? These very low-lying areas, we need to provide, and as you saw at Hamilton, we need to provide sediment to fill them up to reach certain elevations. Is that a good use of resources, or could we use that sediment and that elsewhere to provide different types of protection? So there's lots of choices, lots of trade-offs that we need to think about. And then you've got to think about how expensive or how effective it's going to be and how expensive it's going to be. And one of the biggest costs with all of these is moving dirt. While dirt is dirt cheap, dirt is also very expensive to move. And we don't have a lot of it. We have dirt from construction, we have dirt from dredging, we have dirt in various situations, but we don't have enough to build all the ideas and all the plans that people have been putting forward for sea level rise. So along with trade-offs, we need to think about prioritization. We need to think about where it's best to do these efforts. And we need to think about pairing the problems with the measures. Green solutions are great for waves. They're great for local flooding, providing detention for flooding issues. They're not going to stop sea level rise. The general sea level rise is going to continue regardless of what green solutions we do. The best defense for that is mitigation, is to everyone to drive a Prius around or a Tesla or something like that. The second best thing is the grey infrastructure. We're always going to need sea walls at some places where there are these low-lying areas and the sea level is rising. It's the combination, though, of grey and green that is actually going to be the better solution for us in terms of providing a hybrid, of providing the natural benefits and softening the grey. But at some point, we're always going to need some elevation in there to stop the sea level. We also got to think about on the landscape scale. We have large areas. These are maps from Nevada Creek, thinking about how not just a small marsh, not just one marsh in one area or one beach, but thinking about that whole area could be adapted to provide better protection to the communities and also to Highway 37 and other infrastructure in that area. So we've got to think not only long-term, over hundreds of years, but we also got to think big, over several miles, square miles. And we've got to think about that on all of these areas. So it all adds up to being an expensive proposition, but it's one that we don't have to do all in one go. And this is my last slide, is to echo what Stephanie said, was that we're going to have to be in this for the long term. The sea level rise curves usually stop at 2100 because that's the edge of the page. But at 2100, the curve goes on beyond the edge of the page and it keeps going higher and steeper. And so it's that higher and steeper bit we've got to think about. We're starting on a journey. We're starting to think about how we might adapt. We've got to leave opportunities for future generations to continue that adaptation. We're not going to solve everything, but we're going to provide a start for it. We don't need to build everything right now, but we need to plan ahead. And so this graphic just simply shows that at the beginning, we're talking about and I've used feet of sea level rise as opposed to time to illustrate this. But at the beginning, we've got a foot of sea level rise. A lot of our natural shoreline can accommodate that. But as things get higher, we're going to have to start thinking about placing sediment into those areas, maybe building up marshes. When it's even higher, we've got to start thinking about maybe taller levees or moving some of those levees back. And it's those discussions when it gets really high and thinking about that dreaded term, managed retreat, that's when we've got to have a serious conversation about that. But presently, we've really got to understand what our natural shoreline can accommodate, how it can be made into accommodate with the gray approaches, and think about those hybrid solutions now. And with that, I'll be finished. Thank you.
Happy to be here today. I'm going to be talking about the gray infrastructure, and thanks to Jeremy for setting it up so nicely, because this is the one that I probably am least into, but and I guess I should start by saying that I'm a planner with the county and not an engineer, so a lot of these ideas are engineering solutions, and so I'm going to try and talk about them, but there are definitely folks that are way more knowledgeable than I am on this topic. I wanted to start by saying this community and all of you have a lot of resources to support all your decision making. And so you've heard a little bit about the opportunities with sea level rise. There's a number of resources that have already been put together, a lot of designs that have already been developed for this area, especially for Coyote Creek. One of these tools, we talk about a lot of the different flood types and making sure that we're accommodating all the different flood types. As many of you know, there's flooding from Coyote Creek. There's isolated ponding in places where things are just low or maybe have sunk over time. There's places where the stormwater can't move fast enough, either because of the pump stations or because it's all gravity flow out to the creek or out to the bay. And then we have tidal inundation. And so any solution that we're looking at, especially in places like Tam Valley, have to consider all these things and accommodate all that water. This graphic is from the Southern Marin Watershed Guide, which is actually developed for the Southern Marin community. And it's available with a lot more information about what can be done. So I wanted to start out pointing out another resource, which is the Richardson Day Resilience Story Map. It's a website. This graphic is from the very end of it. So if you get all the way through it, you'll get to these graphics. The idea here is really just to identify what risks we see for the community with 10 inches of sea level rise, along with the 100-year storm. That's something we experience now, or certainly can experience now. And we start to identify all the things that need to be protected or need to be planned around. You know, we can look at a lot of the things that are at risk, and that does give us a good sense of what we need to be planning for and doing moving ahead. So I've been asked to talk about the engineered or the gray solutions. This is the levee at Hamilton, but obviously you have the Coyote Creek levee right here. Levees can certainly protect, and they can be engineered to protect many things. And I think one of the things for this community to consider is, one, levees need to be contiguous, so you can't really just build a levee around part of the creek or part of the shoreline. They have to actually meet end-to-end, low spot, from one low spot or one high spot to the next. And Coyote Creek levee is already there. It does need upgrades. There's an existing study that looked at the levee and came up with a number of different options. But levees like this need to be paired with pump stations like this one. This is the Cardinal pump station. So again, in thinking about all those different flood types, you need to be planning for the water coming, from the creek or from the bay. You also need to be draining all the water that's collecting inside that levee. And so a lot of maintenance, a lot of operations that need to kind of be continued. And then with sea level rise over time, a lot of these things will need to be upgraded, raised, built to deal with a lot more water. So I think there was actually already mention of Japan and the Netherlands. So this is a super levee along with some elevated land in Tokyo, Japan. These kinds of solutions are certainly can be engineered, as you can see. In the United States and kind of just in general, it's hard to get that kind of consensus. There's kind of a resistance to wanting to sacrifice for the greater good, have an impact right now so that people in the future might be able to do a little bit better. But these kinds of projects require massive construction, massive displacement, and then eventually you can see the buildings on the levee, things can be put back, but it does take some time. What we see a lot more of, and I'm glad Jeremy went first because he talked about a lot of the oyster reefs and he talked about beaches. We see right now a lot of our erosion control looks like this, riprap, rocks on the side of the shoreline. They don't do a great job in really protecting from erosion. If you ever go out to the ocean and you watch those big waves crash onto the sand, that energy is dissipated right away. When you see big waves hit these rocks, they pretty much just crash straight into them. That water splashes up and over. And so these types of solutions can do something to reduce risk, but they tend to cause problems and require maintenance as well over time. So we have a lot of these small tide gates around. These are actually both in Marin County, one in Corte Madera, one in Novato. Lots of these tide gates that can control water. I know there's been a lot of discussion, certainly in the Richardson Bay, about various tide gate alignments under the under the Richardson Bay Bridge, along different parts of Richardson Bay. And then there's the big one that's always talked about, which is for San Francisco Bay. And I just want to point out that these types of things do have their function and certainly can reduce some of the impacts. Again, just like those levees, they need to be maintained, they need to be operated. If you have a tide gate and a big storm, you're going to want to move water out over through the tide gates so that the community behind those levees and gates don't flood. And then this is the big one actually in Rotterdam. And so you can actually, stop water. These things can be engineered. And you can stop water at that scale. But again, big capital projects need a lot of agreement. In Marin, it's hard because we have lots of small watersheds, lots of small communities. There's not one solution that can really fix something for everyone here. So Mark's going to be talking about finance, but the financing gets really tricky when you have lots of small communities that need to be planning for this stuff. But the other thing that I'll mention with the large tide gates is just that, with these big projects, you introduce big risks. And so, going back to New Orleans and to the levee failures there, with something this big, and especially with rising tides, you're going to need to continue to upgrade this stuff over time. That's true in Rotterdam, that's true in London. These structures have, a certain amount of capacity, and then they need to be adjusted. And then my last slide is really about flood walls and bulkheads. But really what I wanted to do with this slide is also mention that there are solutions that work at the individual property scale. They don't work for all construction types, so it sort of depends how your house was built, but there are things like door dams and small gates that can be installed. If you go to Heath down in Sausalito, they have a wall in front of their building. They can slide a tide gate in, can reduce some of the flooding and the impacts, at least for the short term. Doesn't solve the problem for long-term sea level rise and a lot of water, but it can actually make a big difference in protecting your structure and your own property. So that's, I think, all of my slides.
So in 2019, we completed this report on adaptation land use planning. It was really specific to how we plan for sea level rise through land use plans. And it was really prepared as a guidance document for our cities and towns. Is that better? Okay. And also a guidance document for us, Marin County, unincorporated Marin County, as we move toward a number of plan updates. And it was very focused on planning measures for Marin County. Just want to set the context here a little bit. So when we talk about land use planning, we're generally talking about general plans. Those are required by the state. So every local government has a general plan. It's a sort of visionary document for the future. And then the general plan is usually implemented through the development code and a permit process. And the development code covers land uses and development on private and public land and buildings and structures. It's got zoning designations and development standards and how you process those regulations through permits. So the regulatory tools that would be common in the implementation programs of the general plan or in the development code for sea level rise include things like overlay zones and combining districts. So you have your zoning in place already. An overlay zone is where you might have some kind of specific considerations that would overlay across multiple zoning designations. So you could have a sea level rise zoning overlay that would cut across all the other overlays on the shoreline, and you could have very specific recommendations within there, within that overlay. Setbacks and buffers are also really common ways to protect sensitive habitat. We use them a lot around creeks, but it's also good to apply them to the tide line. So with shoreline properties, they're sometimes pretty small, so it's best to use them in combination. You can set development back as far as possible on the shoreline and set it as high as possible. The substantial improvements is a regulatory approach that triggers requirements based on a determination that the extent of a proposed improvement is a substantial improvement, and then that triggers other modifications. So where codes have been updated, say for fire or flood considerations since a structure was built, then that structure will have to comply with those codes. So it's a way to bring old development into compliance with new requirements, and you can include flood maintenance requirements or flood elevation like FEMA does. Stormwater management is another tool that we use a lot in land use planning, and you can apply that through permits by requiring, say, a certain percentage of a property has to have impervious surfaces, or you can be very specific and require bioswales and other measures. And of course, dedications and easements and deed restrictions are a mechanism to preserve land for conservation or as open space, and it allows property owners to grant an easement restricting development on a portion of their land for compensation or tax benefits. So that would be the exchange that would happen there is you get property owners to preserve their land and you provide some kind of tax benefit so that they get some kind of financial compensation even as the value of their property decreases as sea level rises. Development moratoriums are a great way to put the brakes on and just do some planning when a situation arises that becomes too complex. And I think there's probably enough said on that. I included this because when we did the report that I referred to, we interviewed all the planning directors for our cities and towns about what kinds of regulatory tools they use. And it was very common to use some of the tools that I just mentioned. And the reason we did that is because we knew we would be updating a number of plans in the near future. We're actually doing that now. And we wanted to, these are more short-term updates for long-term impacts. We want to make sure they're going to fit in with the structures that are already in place, the framework that's already in place. So there's also tax and market-based tools, and I'm not going to talk very much about those because we have Mark here. But I will say that in our survey of planning directors, you can see here that there were far few of these kinds of tools working and in place in our county. So we have a long way to go in terms of how we utilize or can utilize those kinds of tools. I want to talk a little bit about how we're implementing some of these ideas now. Right now, we're updating the safety element, which is part of the countywide plan. It's a requirement that we update that every 8 years from here on out. And the focus of the update is on climate change, adaptation, and resilience. And a big part of that is sea level rise adaptation and resilience. So we have new policies and programs in place, in our draft safety element, to address sea level rise as well as other climate change impacts. One of those is to update our development code, specifically the Bayfront Conservation and Combining District, to address sea level rise. So that's an existing combining district or zoning overlay, and it was originally created to protect habitat and public safety and also views. And we're updating that to include protection against sea level rise for people and property and also habitat. We're not really addressing views in this amendment. So the Bayfront Conservation Area is shown here in gold, and 3.3 feet of sea level rise is shown with the blue hatched area. So the intersection of those two areas, the gold and the blue hatching, is the focus of this amendment. And the reason why it's split along the shoreline is because it's just applied in unincorporated Marin County. What we're trying to achieve here is, in this amendment, is to address sea level rise, to first establish a scenario, which is that intersection area. And then for new habitable development, we're requiring that it be set back and as high as possible on every property. We're requiring for shoreline protection proposals that they must assess nature-based adaptation as part of their project, and only if they find that that's infeasible will we approve hard shoreline armoring. So we want people to look at nature-based adaptation and make sure that that's infeasible before they move to hard shoreline armoring. And then, of course, we have a disclosure to have people acknowledge the risk and liabilities associated with developing in a sea level rise zone. So I think I went about a minute overboard, so I'm going to get out of here.
I'm showing you a bunch of numbers here. We're going to make it really simple. What these are, I call these are Mark's wrong numbers, the best wrong numbers of what it might cost to armor the entire Bay Area, all 9 counties, against sea level rise. And there are 4 columns up there. The one on the left represents the latest project to come out of the ground down in the Santa Clara Valley Water District, Valley Waters El Vista project. That one came in, horizontal levee, nature-based solution, fully bid, fully permitted, under construction, $125 million a mile. Take that in. That was not a Cadillac project. That was basically just doing it simple, $125 million a mile. So just first get your attention in Tam Valley. You look at like Shoreline Highway, Highway 1, Manzanita, up to Almonte, someplace, it's about a mile, more or less. So you're looking at 9 figures based on a project coming out of the ground as what might be your cost. But hold that thought. I'm going to give you good news towards the end here. Okay. The range here, look at that light blue row. The best numbers we've had, which I personally think are really way wrong, it's $1,000 a house per year on a 30-year bond to pay for protecting the bay. Okay. If you go all the way to the left at the El Viso project number, it's $4,000 a house. Now that's taxing all 2 million parcels in the 9-county Bay Area from Gilroy to Cazadero. Okay, so that doesn't mean you're just taxing the people who are going to be flooded. You're taxing every single taxable parcel in the 9-county Bay Area. Hey, no surprise, that is a political heavy lift. Not just the numbers, but having people in Gilroy pay for flooding in the bay. So now I'm going to see if I can press the right button again, or maybe Ted. Oh, it worked out. Jeremy gave you a heads up on this subject we call materials. Okay? One of the things about a horizontal levee is that you're basically building, restoring a marshland. You're building a sponge. And Just to give you an idea that nature-based solutions are well worth considering, I gave you a $125 million a mile number for a project coming out of the ground. The Army Corps for New York on a seawall is estimating, you're all sitting down, $2 billion per mile. The Port of San Francisco, looking at a seawall along 3 or 4 miles of San Francisco city shoreline, is calculated or estimated $1.6 billion per mile. So nature-based solutions, as shocking as spending $100 million a mile may be, cost a whole lot less than building a seawall, at least based on the estimates that are coming out of the Army Corps and the Port of San Francisco. What drives cost on horizontal levees? We now know, particularly from the Alviso project in Valley Water, I won't take you into the weeds on that, is the amount of material. The more nature-based and really green you make it, the more material it requires. Look at the 2 light blue numbers. This is a range for the bay on how many million cubic yards of material might be required. Our low-end number is 24 million cubic yards. High-end number is 150 million. Now, Jeremy's going to slap my paw in a minute because his excellent colleagues over there did some work. They came up with, is it 300 million cubic yards, Jeremy? Yeah, okay. And so, again, Mark's wrong numbers. Jeremy's numbers, which are more right, he came up with 300 million cubic yards. How much soil is that? Right now, as near as I can figure out, in the bay, we dredge, we move about 3 million cubic yards per year. So at 24 million, I like that number. Hey, 8 years of dredging in the bay, we got enough material. We can do that. 150 million, oh, that's like 50 years. Jeremy's number, 300 million, that's 100 years. So depending where we come out on, I'll call these design standards, we end up going from a situation where you can look at it and go, hey, we can do that, to you're going, oh my God, how are we ever going to find the material to do this? So this chart is meant to be an incentive. The public generally doesn't like to get involved in getting in the weeds on what we call design standards. I know our planner over here, Linda, right? Leslie can probably ask her, agree to that. You guys need to get involved in design standards. Depending where we go, it affects how much material is required. That drives up your cost. Are you going to be at $1,000 a house, or are you going to be at $4,000 a house per year for 30 years? This chart is about one of the things that's going to drive that. This is another one. I'm going to take you to point before I'm through that where I really believe that Tam Valley can get off without paying a dime. Okay, hold that thought. I have an idea on that. But this is the chart as to why sooner or later everybody in the Bay, and I think frankly in the state, is going to have to pay something for climate change, for sea level rise, wildfire, regardless of where you live. We have this great thing. 70% of the voters in the Bay Area did a few years ago. They voted for Measure AA for the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. $12 a parcel, low-end number, got 70% yes vote. That money is doing wonderful things for you, for the whole Bay on sea level rise right now. But it's a parcel tax. And taxes available at local government are by statute, in my opinion, socially inequitable to one degree or another. Sales tax, gas tax, ad valorem property tax, parcel taxes, assessments. There is no social equity in those statutes, and I've been living with this for 40 years. It's my business, the municipal bond business. Bottom line, West Oakland, on Measure AA, pays nearly 1,000 times more than Facebook. If you've ever been past the Facebook offices at the foot of the Dumbarton Bridge, it's got sea level rise written all over it. I mean, this multi-billion-dollar deluxe Disneyland real estate complex at the foot of the Dumbarton Bridge. pays $500 and change a year in measured AA. West Oakland pays almost $500,000 a year. That's called social inequity. In fact, that's called a regressive tax. And that piece is something to keep in the back of your mind. That will, when we scale up to try to get 2/3 votes to pay for climate change adaptation in California, in the Bay, this issue is going to become front and center. We can get away with it at $12 tax, $12 a house tax. If you go to $500 a house or $1,000 a house, there'll be a revolt. So now we get to some good news. I'm going to start with some bad news. I'm going to pretend the cost of protecting Tam Valley is $100 million, okay? $100 million a mile. I'm pulling numbers not quite out of the air. Okay, you got 2,500 parcels. You sell a bond issue, it's going to be $6.5 million a year in debt. You got 2,500 parcels to pay it. Do the math. That's $2,500 per house in Tam Valley for a generation. Okay? So that's one of the reasons I am so happy to see so many people in the room, because I really feel like it's a great time to get the community engaged on this and understand what's at stake. Your household budget is at stake. So you don't want to do that. The way you avoid doing that is by getting grant funding. And that's primarily the federal government. And realistically, projects like this primarily are funded by the Army Corps of Engineers. You really want to get to know the Army Corps of Engineers. So you have something for you that few other places in Marin County have going for them. You have a real benefit. Shoreline Highway is called Highway 1. The state of California is going to protect key infrastructure, hell or high water. And in addition, think of how many tens of thousands of your fellow Californians from Imperial Beach to Crescent City live along Highway 1. So they can't, it's all or nothing. You can't abandon one section of Highway 1. You know, you're setting a precedent. I believe that you can get 100% grant funding out of the state going to the federal government to protect Highway 1 through your section, because you're on the other side of Highway 1. And hopefully you can talk the state into protecting where the Dipsy Cafe and Equator, you know, it was and all that on the other side of Highway 1. So that is your plan. You're going to fall in love with Caltrans. You're going to be advocating with Caltrans. And your supervisor, Stephanie, has already done some stuff to open the door for getting Caltrans at the table here to deliver money, and let her take that one. Okay, I'm going to skip the grant stuff because Ted wants to make sure I get through this. I'm going to go to the slide that Ted wanted. The other financing alternatives. Bottom line, realistically, 2/3 votes are required in the state of California to get any tax or bond measure that really matters done. Anything short of that is a sliver. It's a special situation. Don't count on it. Conservation easements, well, you're already built out. You know, that's not going to do much good for you here. Other places, yes. Tax incentives and assessments. Yes, assessments, not, I'm going to get into the weeds a bit legally. Assessments are not feasible for this. We would call them special taxes. The parcel tax required a 2/3 vote for Measure AA. It's a Mello-Roos. Essentially, Measure AA was a Mello-Roos issue. It's a bad word in California. We slipped that one in on you, but without using the Mello-Roos word, but that's what it was. That's a realistic one. Geologic hazard abatement districts are simply not legally, we're not going to work for sea level rise. We have proposed amending that law to change it to make it work for sea level rise and do a number of things, but it's not going anyplace yet. Transfer development rights. This has been from international design teams that have been brought into the Bay to look at options here. They've gone after this, but let me settle you down on this, give you a read of what it would mean. We're going to build whatever seawall, horizontal levee far enough out into Bothine Marsh, is that how you pronounce it? I got it right? So that you're going to create a site for 200 new housing units on what used to be bay or marshland. You're going to sell that off for a bloody fortune. You're going to use the money from selling it off to pay for the seawall or the horizontal levee. That's what that really means when applied. Now, people from overseas look at the bay and going, man, that is your option. You're the most expensive real estate in a region on planet Earth. Why don't you just create new development sites in the bay and get developers to pay for it? But hey, I live here, I understand that. Managed retreat. As has been noted previously, that is an option here. The thing is that's all or nothing. Basically, either you're going to come in, you're going to buy out all 2,500 parcels in Tam Valley, or you're not going to do any of them. It doesn't matter. You can't just nickel and dime it. And it's been tried by FEMA to nickel and dime on the Gulf Coast in hurricane zones. It just really doesn't do a whole lot for you. So I'm almost on time, almost. So I'm done. I'm going to let you press the right button. I'm going to go back and sit down. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark, and thanks to our panelists. A lot of information, a lot to think about. Appreciate everything that they've done, and we'll thank them again at the end. Now it's time to discuss. Excuse me. You have on your table a few items, So please be sure you're sitting at a table. One is a packet of images that represent the various adaptation strategies identified in the San Francisco Estuary Institute's Adaptation Atlas and referred to by our panelists. We want you to react to those. Now, these are the prompts that we want you to address, okay? And again, you'll have about 20 minutes. Are there adaptations that resonate positively for you? Please name them and give a brief sense of why you like them. Stay brief on all these things. Are there adaptations that present challenges that concern you? Again, name them and say why. And then what big questions do you have? If you want a response, please write your email on the survey along with the question, and we'll do our best to get back to you. Or you can email the question to tamvalleynrg@gmail.com. We just want your initial reactions. So what I'm going to do is ask a representative from each table to come up to the microphone and just give a 1 minute or less summary of what you guys talked about.
We discussed green solutions, which was really the interest that we have as it relates to implementing any type of change within the marsh areas. And the reason for that is because it's sustainable. The second is to really focus on what we have, which is the marsh, which is a marsh restoration. I think that would be the first push as it relates to thinking of all the buildings behind us like a crescent moon. How are we going to create change within those buildings? Which takes me to the second bullet, which is, as I mentioned, we can't boil the ocean here. So you're looking at 100 years. Well, what about 10 years, 15 years? What can you do in 10 or 15 years? The next question is, how much money do you have? Do you have 20 million? What are you going to do with $20 million? What kind of strategies can you deploy to spend that wisely and develop a plan of attack and actually have an implementation and strategy to actually do that? So we need to figure out how much money you have, how much time you have, and within that window, come up with some solutions with a lot of different agencies. I think the big question we had is, who are the agencies that we reach out to? You mentioned some of them earlier. And how do we do that? How do we begin a grassroots program to engage Caltrans? How do we get people from Caltrans here to have a discussion about what, I'd like to hear their impression of how are you going to address this? What are you doing to address this? And to put them on the spot, I'd like to hear what their comments are.
We thought that what made the most sense was to do a phased approach, to build out the marshes where we already have them, put some money into that, build up the levees, maybe to create a double levee system up against the businesses on the far side of Shoreline Highway and maybe farther along the old path or soon-to-be old path, and then to look at walls too, where we could. The challenges is obviously the cost. So we thought that having a multi-agency, I guess, approach, so use the idea of Caltrans, maybe look to Army Corps or FEMA to help with some of the solutions, and then that we all probably would need a parcel tax. So we'd be willing to consider that with help from some of the federal agencies.
We were discussing a bit how, in a way, the birdland area here in Tam Junction is kind of a model for what probably is going to be the more common adaptation, which is to have some form of levee or wall, or whether it's a green levee or a gray infrastructure, to keep the sea level rise out in the near term. And then you need the pump stations that we have here to get the rainwater out when the rain events come. And it's not a bad short-term solution, but there are some real vulnerabilities like we experienced in this neighborhood last winter, because keeping those pumps operating and efficient to get the rainwater out when we have big storm events requires them to be in really good mechanical condition and for the maintenance to happen. And we saw a breakdown in that in this last winter. In addition, there's the dredging that's required for the watersheds that are coming down, the creekways and all of that, so that those don't back up and cause upstream flooding. And so it's not going to be fail-safe for sure. There's a lot of very real vulnerabilities involved in this, and there's a lot of cost involved in that. And I see that sitting on the flood board because we have to review the budgets for all the maintenance on these pump stations and replacement parts and all of that. Nonetheless, I do think that's probably a model that we should understand and look at how to replicate that to protect the homes that are in the low-lying areas, at least for the short term or through mid-century. But at a certain point, it's going to be really difficult to keep doing that as sea level rise comes up 7 feet, 10 feet, 15 feet. I mean, the projections the next century are that it could be quite high. And there will be a certain time when the groundwater that rises with the sea level rise actually catches us from underneath, and we're going to need to be looking at a managed retreat scenario or elevating structures in a more kind of what they call living with water scenario, where it's actually flooding more regularly around our houses, but we had figured out a way to get in and out of them and to have infrastructure so we can still live in those neighborhoods.
Our task force will compile all of your comments and survey results, so we can analyze them to find common patterns in the issues and the values about Tam Valley that you indicate. From this data, we will derive a draft of the prioritized guideline statement that I talked about at the beginning in the introduction. We hope to include in that draft some kind of graphic that illustrates which of the various adaptation strategies make the most sense given the prioritized guidelines identified. Our plan is to send out a draft of that prioritized guideline statement by December 1st, with the request that we get feedback by December 15th so that we can revise it and then have the final draft out by the end of this year. Again, to be sure you're on the email distribution list, be sure that you fill out the sign-in sheet on your table. As I said earlier, these guidelines will be then used to guide decision-making at the local, state, and federal levels. So how will that work? We've been working very closely with Supervisor Moulton-Peters on this question, and together we have agreed to organize some kind of official body that includes representatives of our community, the supervisor's office, and county experts to facilitate interaction with Caltrans and other technical and funding agencies. We hope to figure out what that official body looks like in the next couple months, and we'll keep you up to date with our progress. Now, we also need engagement and leadership from the neighborhoods most likely to be impacted by sea level rise. That includes, of course, Birdland, K Park, and the business community. This is your future more than anyone else's. So if you can help, please email tamvalleynrg@gmail.com. Okay, so to wrap up, first of all, thank you again for coming. This is awesome. I love the discussions I was hearing. It's really important and rich and difficult, and I appreciate your being here for that. Again, if it's not written on the surveys or some piece of paper that we can collect, do send your comments to tamvalleynrg@gmail.com. I want to thank our speakers who did a fantastic job just filling us with ideas and information. I want to thank our camera person, John Duncanson, in the back there, who again he and Sylvia were producers of the Waters Rising film that's on our website. And thank you all for coming. We'll be in touch.